forecasters with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration called for an active Atlantic hurricane season back in May. They estimated that 8 to 13 storms could become hurricanes, and up to 7 of them could be major hurricanes. But now the tropics seem to be looking quiet. Here to break down this suddenly quiet hurricane season is Dr. Kelly Nunez-Ocasio. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit more. Why did we originally believe that this could be a very active season for us?
The main reason was that all the what we call the main ingredients for a tropical cyclone to form were going to be there and are there. We have the warm sea surface temperature, the very moist atmosphere, moderate to weak vertical wind shear, and instability. All of the conditions that traditionally we know can favor the formation of hurricanes. But as we are learning, especially in the recent decades, those conditions may be there and a tropical cyclone doesn't form.
So what has changed now that we're seeing a little bit quieter conditions?
So what's happening with this Atlantic hurricane season is that we're seeing that indeed there's more moisture in the atmosphere, which is causing the African monsoon to be very wet and very moist. Usually those are conditions that initiate a lot of convection and initiate these tropical cyclone seeds over Africa, which then they lead to becoming hurricanes. But we're not seeing that happening. And so what we're actually seeing is a very moist monsoon, and what we call the jet wave system is actually shifted northward, and we're not seeing genesis. And so it's interesting that it's happening right now, because I recently investigated that these are actually the conditions that happen when I studied a case study with my modeling simulations, well, our outer moisture, and saw that indeed more moisture in the atmosphere may delay tropical cyclogenesis. So is this actually what's happening in real life right now? We'll have to see later in the season whether or not we will see some spin up.
Okay, so we are seeing some areas of interest right now, some things that people are keeping an eye on in the Atlantic and even towards the in our area in the Gulf Coast. And so when we talk about these areas of interest, how do those differ from actual storms?
Areas of interest are actually what we typically call easterly waves or potential seeds of a tropical cyclone. And so they don't necessarily have a defined center of circulation, but they do have likelihood of further development, which is how the NHC, the National Hurricane Center, and NOAA flag these types of systems. So they have the potential because they are quote unquote healthy enough in terms of convection being active, that they can probably, with the good conditions, initiate a tropical cyclone. And we do have a few of these systems over the Atlantic right now. Whether or not they will develop, it's very hard to forecast at this moment. We do have some percentage of development, but we'll have to see if these actually do develop in these very moist conditions. It really seems to be the case that there is this Goldilocks zone where if it's too dry or too moist, systems may not be able to initiate. So it is interesting to see that perhaps this is the case for the season where it's just too moist, yet systems are not developing as we thought.
Interesting. You know, we typically think of hurricanes and think of moisture, think of needing that to exist. And so seeing this contrast of, you know, it being too moist, when we talk about our conditions here, what does that mean for this development of these potential future storms?
Right. It really comes down to not always being aware and always preparing, regardless of whether or not the hurricane season is going to become active later in the season, earlier. What we're supposed to do is prepare for any impact, and that means that regardless of whether or not a system traverses the Atlantic as a tropical cyclone or as just an easterly wave, these easterly waves come coupled to convection that causes flooding, that causes a lot of rainfall damage. So the Caribbean and in the eastern U.S. have to prepare for these types of events. So I think the main key message here is that, yes, we are seeing some changes in the Atlantic hurricane season. It seems to be the case that more moisture may not necessarily lead to rapid TC genesis. It could be more delayed, but it may still happen. So let's keep an eye out, let's be aware, and let's prepare. I think that's the right message to take home.
Absolutely. We will definitely have to wait and see what happens. But Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the show
Thank you so
today.
much for having me.